करूयात सुरू.
हो. नमस्कार. महाराष्ट्र वृक्ष संवर्धिनीमध्ये सर्वांचे स्वागत आहे. यावर्षी आपण मंथली लेक्चर म्हणजे मासिक प्रबोधन व्याख्यानमालेमध्ये इन्व्हेजिव्ह हा विषय घेतलेला आहे. तर आजचं व्याख्यान देण्यासाठी मेघा ओझा आलेले आहेत. नमस्कार, तुमचं स्वागत आहे.
थँक्यू.
या मी उपाध्याय मॅडमना विनंती करते की त्यांनी मेघा मॅडमची ओळख करून द्यावी.
थँक्यू मॅडम. I am very happy to introduce Megha Ojha. She is a young, brilliant talent of our country. She is PhD student actually from the Department of Botany, ISER. Very recently, she had submitted her dissertation under the guidance of Dr. Deepak Barua sir. She had completed her BSc in Botany and MSc in Environmental Sciences from University of Delhi. She has been conducting research on this very sensitive topic from 2017. She has published few her observations in reputed journals on the invasive biology. So this is our dear actually topic today. The topic has its own gravity and intensity, and young researcher, I welcome Megha in this session, and I request Megha to deliver her talk. Megha, please.
Thank you, ma'am. I'll share my screen. I hope my presentation is visible.
Yes, it is. It is.
Yeah?
It is.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
It is clear. It is clear.
Okay, great. Thank you. So, good evening and welcome everyone. I am very grateful and thankful for being given this opportunity to talk about invasive plants and then the research also that I have done on invasive plants in and around this region. So, in today's talk, I'll talk about the science behind the success of invasive plants. So, currently on your screen, you're seeing different invasive organisms. They are snakes, frogs, birds, fishes, and they're everywhere. But the talk today I will be concentrating on plants because that's the area of expertise that I have. So to start with, why study invasive species? And I'm sure in the lectures in this series, people have introduced about the importance of it. So I'll quickly just recap why it is important to study invasive species. So IUCN, which is a very important environmental international body, talks about invasive species as species which are introduced outside its natural past or present distribution. And if this species becomes problematic, then they are called as invasive alien species. Now, invasive species have negative impact at multiple levels of biodiversity. So the negative impact can be restricted to smaller population of certain species or can cause extinction of species altogether. They can alter the community composition of an area and have negative impact on ecosystem function or the services that we are getting from that ecosystem. Invasive species have contributed to 60% of global species extinctions in recent times. And the impact is not just restricted to negative impacts on biodiversity, but also they have huge negative economic impact. And in fact, across the world, India faces the third highest economic cost related with management and losses incurred due to invasive species. So, a quick history of the invasion biology. So, Charles Elton is known as the father of invasion biology. And in his book, back in 1958, he talked about that outbreaks in population of species that occurs because of a foreign species' successful invasion in another country. But it is very important and critical to understand what do we mean by foreign, right? So if you look at this is a temporal map, right? So we go from 1500 AD is, or 1500th century is when we define the point of anything that has been present in an area since before 1500 is going to be considered as native, and only species that have come to a particular region after 1500 AD are going to be considered as non-native or foreign in that sense. But also, there is a possibility that a species was not present before 1500 and over the period of time naturally migrated to that region. In case that has happened, that species will still be considered as a natural migrant and therefore native to that region. So, if we look at what has happened after 1500 AD, which is the cutoff point of defining something as non native, we see that across the world there has been a rapid increase in number of alien species with time, and this increase has been exponential around the globe. But everything which is alien, which is everything which is foreign, is not actually invasive. So I this diagram here shows a species pool. So all these different in are different species, right? In the species pool. Now imagine the species pool to be in an area in Mexico. Everything which is there in Mexico to come to India will have to cross these three distinct filters. The first filter is dispersal filter, which is only the species which actually can successfully disperse from Mexico to India will be able to cross that dispersal filter. Once it has come to India and has crossed the dispersal filter, it will have to have abilities to sustain the environmental conditions in India. So not every species which has come to a region will be able to tolerate the temperature or precipitation gradient present in the new region, right? So only subset of them which will be able to tolerate the environmental condition will cross the second filter, which is the environmental filter. And then finally, even if it can remain in that given environmental condition, there will be all sorts of biotic interactions happening, which is there will be herbivory, there will be competition with the native community, and all these kinds of things will limit a species' presence in an area. So basically everything that can cross a geographical barrier, which is the first filter, the dispersal filter, is actually alien, right? But not everything that is alien will actually be able to reproduce in a new area. So only once it starts reproducing on its own without any human intervention will it be called naturalized. And then only a subset of species which have naturalized will now become invasive, which is basically they will have a negative impact on biodiversity and will start, invading the natural habitats in an area. So with this we know, and people have been talking about it, that there is something called as tens rule, which is only 10% of the species which are imported get introduced in the natural environment. Only 10% of the ones which are introduced in the natural environment get established there, which is now they can grow and reproduce on their own. And only 10% of that actually becomes a pest or invasive. So this is a very important rule, and it's important to understand that not everything which is alien is actually invasive. And this 10% rule has actually been studied and reported from different groups and different regions. And if you look at here, the percent success, most of the tests, only 10 to 20% is the range where most of the species which are introduced actually become an invasive. So we have empirical evidence of this rule. Now, there are different hypotheses associated with invasion. So, what actually make a species invasive, right? And that will actually be associated with the fact that a species will be able to cross all the three barriers, that is dispersal, environmental filter, and the biotic interactions. And there are a lot of hypotheses in the field of invasion biology. I'll only be covering some of the most important and well studied ones. So there are different stages of invasion. First, introduction, species is introduced in a region. Second, it naturalizes, which is now it can grow and reproduce on its own. And then invasion, which is now it will start dispersing and causing problem to the native biodiversity. So we'll start with the introduction. So one important hypothesis that is associated with introduction is human trait and invasion, which is the human beings are actually causing deliberate or accidental introduction of invasive species. So basically, a species which was present in Mexico, which naturally could have never come to India had it followed its natural dispersal path, actually got introduced because of human intervention. and human trade and invasion is very closely related. Now, studies have shown that increase in trade leads to increase in the rates of naturalization. That is, more the number of species, more the trade from a region, more the number of species that get introduced, and therefore more they become naturalized. So, what is the underlying ecological process that's happening here? That is, the species are overcoming the geographical barrier because of humans acting as a dispersal agent. And there are a lot of studies, global studies that have shown it. So highest number of naturalized species which are present in any continent, that is in North America. And the major contributor of these alien species across the world are actually Europe and temperate Asia. Both of these regions are known to have higher trade routes in the past for across the world. And it's not just introduction, but how many number of times the introduction has happened also contributes to the invasion success of a species. So for example, usually when something is introduced to a new region, it will have a lower genetic variation. Why? Because only a small population is getting introduced. But what happens with multiple introduction is a lot more variation gets introduced because a lot different population gets starts to getting introduced, right? Now because of uh, this, the species will now have more genetic variation in the region that it is introduced in, and therefore become more successful. So genomic admixtures that are caused due to multiple introduction can increase the fitness of the species which is getting introduced in the invasive range, which is the range that it is getting introduced to. And a underlying ecological process that is happening here is there increase in variability of invaded population. And that variability, that variation in the genetic makeup actually helps species to cross both the environmental barrier and the biotic barrier. So one example of this I'll show. So this study, so this is a crab. This is the on the map. If you will see, the red region are where the crab has been introduced. So it's non-native region, and the green region is its native region. So it's native to that area. So what was happening was, if you will follow this line, the red line that is here, till 19 mid 19 or early 1900s, the crabs population was restricted to the lower end of this, right? And then suddenly after 1950s, the huge invasion of this crab started. Sorry, I'm so sorry. Crab started in the other region, and then mitochondrial DNA analysis showed that it is not actually the population around this Massachusetts or New York that has expanded its range, but it was multiple introduction, which is another introduction that happened near this region, which actually led to the invasion and success of this invasive crab in this region. So with this introduction done, we move to the next stage, which is establishment and naturalization. So one very important hypothesis is of biotic resistance. So, what biotic resistance says is that the resident community has the ability to resist the invasion by another foreign species, and that is basically known as biotic resistance. And what we mean by resident community is uh, everything, plants, animals, pathogens, everything is involved in the process of biotic resistance, right? But and how it works is also very interesting. So, what happens is there is a negative biotic interaction with the native community, which makes overcoming the biotic barrier difficult. So, what is happening is the native community, which will be plants, pathogens, animals, everything, will actually try to competitively inhibit the invader to establish in an area. And that is why there are studies which have shown that if you have more diversity, invader will find it difficult to establish in an area with more diversity. So one example of this is from North America. So Agropyron cristatum, uh, studies was done to understand the growth rate of a invasive individual, right, of this species. What was seen is that in regions where native vegetation was intact, the agropyron grew slowly. So there was a lower growth rate. So it was inhibited. But wherever the native vegetation was removed and then agropyron establishment was assessed, people saw that this was actually growing faster in those regions. So it means that native community was doing something to inhabit to inhibit the establishment of this invasive species. Another important hypothesis, the way which invader can actually become successful, is enemy release hypothesis. And this basically talks about the absence of a specialist enemy of the invader in the new range. So if you look at this graph here, A, right? You just look at the A panel. So you have there is a study species, which is basically the species which will become invader, and then there are native competitors in the native range of a species, which is where it belongs to. So, for example, Mexico, right? In Mexico, both these species will have a generalist enemy, which is a herbivore, which is eating both of these species, and also a specialist enemy, which is basically only specializes in controlling the population of that particular species. Now, in B panel, what is happening is in a new region, the specialist enemy of that species is absent. So the species has come from Mexico. The generalist enemy, which is the generalist herbivore, will be able to eat it. But its specialist herbivore has not come from Mexico. And therefore, there's nobody to inhibit the population in this new region. And therefore, it will start to actually outcompete the native species, which has pressure of both the generalist enemy and the specialist enemy. So there are impacts by mammalian herbivore, there will be insect herbivores, and then there'll be soil pathogens. So at different levels, what is happening is this negative biotic interactions in invaded region, which the invader is overcoming because it does not have its specialist either mammalian herbivore or insect herbivore or soil pathogens. So this is how it's escaping the enemy, getting released from the enemy, and therefore actually becoming more dominant. So this is one example of enemy release hypothesis that has been studied. So if you look at this, it's a congeneric species that we're talking about. One is Inoceras japonica, which is an invasive species. The other one is native species. So studies showed that if you exclude herbivores, so all these above were the herbivores present in that region. If you actually create plots where herbivore exclusion is happening, nothing happens to the establishment and success of the invader, but actually the native species start to now actually increase. So that actually shows that the herbivore was negatively impacting the native species, and therefore its exclusion was actually beneficial. But the invader was not anyway getting much affected by the native population of herbivores which was there, and therefore its exclusion didn't make any difference. So it means that the invader was actually already excluded from the herbivores. And the last stage is the invasion, right? So invasion is now that the species actually starts to become a pest, which is it starts to inhibit the growth and reproduction of the native population. So one very interesting and important hypothesis is the novel weapon hypothesis. What it says is that invaders can transform the native region where they're coming, because with them they possess a new weapon. And when they say new weapon, it's actually a biochemical weapon. So they come with such powerful allelopathic agent that they actually start impacting the native biodiversity, which has never seen that agent, right? It has never seen that chemical before, so it does not have a mechanism to deal with the chemical that the invader is bringing, and therefore it starts to uh, die out or lose in competition. So unique chemicals have been isolated from invasive and native populations, and we have seen that these chemicals differ in the amount that they are produced, so quantity, and also their allelopathic ability. And the same pattern was found even when experiments were done in situ conditions, which I'll show in the subsequent slides, which is basically species were brought into the lab, compounds were extracted, and it was seen that what is the impact on the native community of the compounds that are getting extracted from the invader. So the underlying ecological processes, the invader is actually altering the biogeochemical cycle, and it helps in overcoming the environmental barrier. It can also actually overcome the biotic interactions by negatively affecting the native species through the chemical that it produces. So this is the example of novel weapon hypothesis. So Centuria diffusa, it's actually the native range is on the right hand side on the Caucasus mountain ranges, and it's actually an invader in the North American continent. So people were trying to understand that what is actually contributing to invasion of this species in the North America. So they conducted a series of in situ experiments, which is in the laboratory. So in the green is the American species, which is basically Native American species, which co-occurs with Centuria, right? And then you have the invader Centuria, and the light green is the Caucasian species. So Caucasian species is basically those native species which co-occur with Centuria in its native range. So what they did is they started growing the American native species and the Caucasian native species with Centuria diffusa. And then in one set they had this growth, and the another one they added activated carbon. So what activated carbon would do is any chemical that is getting produced, it will absorb it, and therefore it will not let that chemical have any sort of impact on the native community that it is growing with, right? And what they found is that when you compare the control, which is just the growth of Centuria with the native Caucasian native species, and then you add activated carbon, there is no change. So if you'll see, there are five individuals of Caucasian here, and there are five individuals of Caucasian native here, right? There is no change that's happening. However, when this same was done with American species, so when American species were only three, right? But once activated carbon was added, which would have absorbed the chemical that the Centuria was producing, we see that the number of this American native species actually increased. So it means that the chemical that the Centuria was releasing was actually having a negative impact on the American native species. And removal of that chemical because of activated carbon, we see that the number of native species, American native species, increases. Right? So this is basically what novel weapon hypothesis is. And then there is another interesting hypothesis known as fluctuating resource hypothesis, which says that systems where there is a lot of variation in resources will have more chance of invasion. So this is very commonly you can also easily understand, because often we see wherever there is a lot of disturbance, a lot of invasive species come in the region where there are a lot of disturbance. And that actually happens because there is an alteration in environmental conditions. So imagine there is a region, and then you have a disturbance. Disturbance leads to removal of native species. Resources in that region become available, and then invasive species can come and utilize that resource and become dominant there, right? So invasibility of a community is positively related with the amount of unused resource that is available in that community. And that increase in resource can occur either due to decline in resource used by resident communities, so the resident or the native community gets removed, and therefore resource becomes available for the invader to come, or increase in resource supply faster than the resident communities can sequester. So resident community are not harming, but you're adding, say, nitrogen addition is happening, in which case what will happen, there is a surplus of resource available, and therefore the invader can come and impact it. So basically this is showing in this graph that on x-axis is the resource supply and y is the resource uptake. As you move towards the right hand side, what is happening is the resource supply is increasing. In the black region, resource supply is increasing and uptake is decreasing. And therefore in this region, you will see a lot of invasive species coming up. Okay. And again, we have empirical evidence for even this hypothesis, which is basically for Avena fetua. What people found is that when there is disturbance, the species has a higher establishment rate compared to plots where disturbance was excluded. And in those plots, Avena could actually not, there was a lower establishment rate. Native species did not, and they actually did it not just with Avena, but also compared it with the co-occurring native species. And what they saw is that whether disturbance was present or not present did not actually impact the response of the native species. It was actually just the invasive species which was actually doing better whenever there was disturbance. So with this, all the hypotheses that we talked about, this graph, this was a study in 2012 that actually compared how many, there are a lot of studies. So how many studies are supporting these hypotheses and how many studies are actually contradicting these hypotheses. So clearly we can see, so in this talk, I actually talked about three major hypotheses: biotic resistance, novel weapon, and enemy release, right? So we clearly see that there is differential support in literature for these different hypotheses. For example, only around 30% of the studies are supporting the biotic resistance hypothesis. Whereas for novel weapon hypothesis, we have more support. There are 70% studies that are showing that this is how an invader is impacting. But clearly, we are seeing that there are a lot of supports, but also contradictions for these different hypotheses. What does this mean? This means is that there are problems and there is no one solution, right? So there are multiple hypotheses and they all seem to have partial evidence. So we can't say that this is the way an invader is invading. There is a lot of context dependencies. So in some places, this will be the mechanism that a species will follow to invade. In another place, it will be a different mechanism through which an invader will invade, right? And therefore we have lack of enough empirical evidence across various scales and different conditions. So we actually need to collect more data to make a general statement. With whatever data we have right now, we know that there are a lot of contradictions and supports. But invasion biologists are reluctant to let go of these hypotheses because they have developed it and they have some empirical evidence of it. So they're very attached with that idea. And because of that, they're not letting go of hypotheses which are not really, we are not finding a lot of support for these hypotheses. And so to say this is the mechanism with which all invasive species are behaving would be incorrect. So, what is the solution to it? Then, how do we study invasion at a larger spatial scale or global spatial scales? The support solution to this would be hierarchy of hypothesis, which is we will have to look at where what is working. You know, it will help us understand which hypothesis works under which circumstances, and then context dependency is very important to understand. And it is okay that not everything will work under every condition, and understand, okay, this is what works for this condition and these are the mechanisms through which invasion is happening, and therefore design your control or management plans according to that. And another would be networking helps in understanding redundant hypotheses. So there are a lot of hypotheses which would be redundant, and it is important to understand what and reduce this redundancy. And one way to go about it, and what is now emerging, is the field in the field of invasion biology is the trait-based approach. Okay, so what are traits? Traits are a set of uh, measurable, quantifiable uh, things, syndromes, which basically help a organism grow, survive, or reproduce in an area. Okay, now there are certain traits which are associated with weedy species. So if you study species which are weeds, need not be invasive, but even native which are weeds, there will be certain traits that make them weedy, right? And when people started to compare multiple species which were invasive, they started uncovering a broader ecological pattern. And this started to come up across the globe for all the species which were invasive. And then invasion biologists actually identified 38 such traits which were frequently associated with the success of invasive species. So it is not just one hypothesis or one chemical, but there are trait syndromes which are associated with the success of invasive. And I'll talk about what I mean by these traits and what are these traits that people found, right? So it, and also it's not just the trait that is important, but the trait difference, which is for example, height is a trait, right? So if I'm looking at height, it's not that this is 20 centimeter and that is going to help a species become invader. A 20 centimeter in a native community where everything else is say 5 centimeters will be more important than in a community where everything is 10 centimeters. And people have seen this, that for performance related traits, invasive species usually have higher value than the native community, right? And Therefore, it is now very well established that trait-based approach will help us go beyond context dependency and understand invasion at a larger spatial scale. So I asked this question. I wanted to understand for my research, are there traits or can traits explain success of invasive plants in the northern Western Ghats? So this, what I did is, I, with the help of my collaborators, we identified 79 invasive plants of northern Western Ghats and Konkan and studied 5 traits which were related to competition, resource use, and reproduction. Then we looked at the relationship between the traits of these species with their spatial extent, which is how widespread these species are in the northern Western Ghats and Konkan. And we also compared the trait overlap, which is the trait value of the invader with the native community it was present in, right? And I actually used herbaria-based approach to understand the spatial distribution of the species. So I actually collected over 6,000 occurrence data points from 4 herbaria, which is BSI Pune, ARI Pune, Blatter in Mumbai, and Shivaji University Herbaria in Kolhapur. Along with that, I used flora information, other publication, and global databases to collect the occurrence data points of these species in northern Western Ghats and Konkan. And this is a representative example, right? So these are 3 species: Cosmos pipenatus, Acacia auriculaformis, and Alternanthera sessilis. And the points, the red dots, are their occurrence points. So we see that there are certain species which are less widespread, whereas there are few which are extremely widespread. So there is a difference in how widespread a species becomes. So not all invaders are present everywhere. So there is a difference in their spatial distributions. And we also studied the spatial spread over time, which is how the species after its introduction has changed over the period of time. So because every species will have a phase when after its introduction, it will be in the lag phase, which is when it will have lower distribution, and then suddenly it will start to increase, which is the slope of increase, and then eventually it will start to saturate. So for this, I'm just showing the Cassia occidentalis, one of the species, how from the time it was introduced over how it has changed in this region. But so now looking at the traits, what we found. So these are the traits that we studied: leaf area, stem, seed mass, height, LDMC, and LMA. I will not go into the detail of these traits, but just to give an example, LDMC and LMA are leaf traits. So basically, they talk about resource use. So plants which will have higher LMA will have slower resource use, whereas plants which have lower LMA will have faster resource use. Height is directly related to competition. Taller you are, better competitor you are. And seed mass is related to your reproductive output. So I can either produce smaller many seeds, lighter, less seed mass, many seeds, or I can produce one seed with larger seed mass. So what we found is that species which use trait combinations which are associated with faster resource use are actually the ones which are more successful. So those species which have faster resource use in northern Western Ghats and Konkan actually end up occupying more spatial distribution. They end up occupying more number of grids. I also looked at something which is very well studied, another strategy, which is CSR strategy: competition, stress tolerant, and rural. So what we find is that uh, nowadays you can actually use leaf traits to measure the CSR strategy of a species. We found that there is actually a relationship between CSR strategy and the invasion success of a species. So these are all the 79 species, and this is the CSR triangle. And what we found is that species which were more rural, which is more disturbance, those which benefited from disturbance, actually ended up occupying more area in the northern Western Ghats and Konkan. And this is not surprising, right? Given that how with changing environment, there is a change in disturbance regime and changing in land use, land cover, there's so much disturbance happening. So of course, those species which are going to be widespread are the ones which are going to be able to survive in the disturbed conditions or thrive in the disturbed conditions. And when we actually compared the invasive species trait space with the native species, as expected, we did find that the invasive species occupied a distinct trait space from the native community. So on the blue, all these triangles, blue triangles are the native species, and the red circles are the invasive species co-occurring with the native species. So we clearly find that the red circle is on the right hand side from the blue, and which is more in the direction of increasing height and La. So which is invasive species are more competitive or taller and have larger leaf area compared to the co-occurring native species. I also this result I'll just quickly show because I wanted to understand the impact of invasion, right? And for this we have looked at species richness as one parameter across a gradient of invasion in broadleaf and fine-leaf savannas which are found around Pune. And what we see is that as you move from left to right, you're moving towards more invaded community. And we see that there is a distinct change in the number of species as the invasion is increasing. So more the invasion, less the number of native species in an area, right? And it's not just at the species level, but even at functional level. So communities are also become functionally more dissimilar with each other. So if you look at this graph over here, this panel, it's as you follow the arrow, we are moving from uninvaded to invaded communities, more invaded communities. So we see that compositionally, like which kind of native species or invasive species are present are also very different. So invasive species is not just causing the loss of number of species, but the kind of native species that it allows to grow is also very different. And what do I mean by different? For that, you have to come to this last panel over here, which is basically invaded communities. Again, you follow the arrow, you're going from uninvaded to highly invaded community. So basically, the native species which are present in regions which are invaded are also the ones which have higher resource use capability. So I know it can be a bit complicated, but to simplify it, the point here is that invasion not just causes the loss of richness of the species, which is how many number of species which are present, but also the kind of species which are present. So basically, an undisturbed forest will support certain kind of trees, right? But then once disturbance happens, those endemic and endangered species cannot grow there. So just like disturbance in a forest, in savannas, invasion is doing something similar, which is it is the altering and replacing very important savanna species and replacing it with more ruderal and weedy species. So, one takeaway that I would want you to have from my talk is the trait based understanding of invasive species is a promising field of research which will help us to go beyond context dependency and identify what is actually helping a species become invader. With this, I would like to thank my collaborators and funding agency, my guide, Dr. Deepak Barua, and this work would not have been possible without help of Dr. Mandar Datar, Dr. Ashish Nerlekar, Bhushan, and Prerna Agrawal. Thank you, and I'm open to questions.
Thank you.
I'm open to questions. If anybody has questions, I can answer.
Sure, sure.
Yeah.
You can unmute and ask the question.
Hello, I have a question.
Yes.
Uh, what effect and what is the interaction caused by pollinators and other insects which are involved in pollination and fertilization process of the plants, existing plants? Do they
Uh,
have any effect with invasive plants also? And what kind of effect?
Okay, so the you are asking if invasive species can have an impact on the pollinator
Yeah.
of
Hmm.
the native species, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. They do have an impact, and it has been very well studied. So, for example, a lot of these invasive species, because they are introduced for ornamental purposes, so often these actually support a lot of pollinators. So a lot of native species, which, say for example, they are pollinated by something, those pollinators will move from the native species to the invasive species, because they are they have traits which actually help the pollinator. So that way the native species can also get negatively impacted, because the pollinator is now shifting from the native species to the invasive species.
Mm, mm. Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Megha, for informative lecture. Very nice.
Thank you.
Megha, you just mentioned that for the cultivated species specifically.
Yes.
So, can you elaborate something more for the cultivated plants and the invasiveness?
Yes. So
A
it's a
short,
very,
small note, small note.
yeah, it's a very interesting question. Thank you for this. So what happens is, people have found that because a lot of these invasive species are actually cultivated species. Of course, there are those which are not cultivated, but often many of these invaders are cultivated. Why it happens is, a lot of, if you're introducing a species, there are certain traits that you select for. You want the flowers to be showy. You would want it to be able to say tolerate certain harsh conditions. So in which case what happens is, you're actually selecting for introduction certain species which are actually going to have traits which will help them thrive. So in such cases, when these species escape cultivation, they already have a trait which helps them become invasive, and therefore often the cultivated species will end up actually become invasive.
Okay, okay, great, great. And what about the genetical variability? You have touched the point, but still, and
Yes, so
the yes, the ecological niches, they have very specific impact of the genetic variability. So,
uh,
invasive genetic variability and ecological niche.
yeah, so with genetic variability, as I said, that once a population is introduced, it is often a smaller population, and therefore it will have less genetic variability, and therefore you might think it might or might not perform well. But due to multiple introductions, the genetic variability will start to increase, and also the plasticity of the plasticity of the plant, and therefore it will now start becoming more and more invasive. With ecological niche, it is very well studied in a lot of invasive species that they have a broader ecological niche, so
Right,
they can actually tolerate a lot of environmental, they can grow from in a range of temperature and precipitation gradient, and that is one of the reasons that it is successful, because it has a very broad ecological niche.
right, right. Because you have given certain examples for the addition of carbon and nitrogen. So,
Yes,
I asked
yes,
about the genetical niche, the ecological niche, because
yes.
when we are talking about specifically carbon and
Hmm.
the nitrogen, then
Hmm.
niche becomes very, very important.
Yeah, but otherwise also, even if you're not adding carbon and nitrogen, and we are just talking about ecological niche without any addition, even then it is very important, because a species which has a broader ecological niche can come and establish from, say, northern Western Ghats to Himalaya, right? Because it can tolerate that variation in environmental
Yes.
conditions, whereas otherwise it can't. So that is very important.
Any more questions from the participants?
Excuse me, ma'am. Can I ask a question?
Sure, sure, sure.
Yeah, yeah. So my question is, with all these studies, can it be predicted? Like if certain species which have been introduced now
Hmm.
can show invasive traits in future, so that the steps can be taken right away before they become a problematic species.
Yes. So
Uh,
that is, sorry, do you have more questions? You can go ahead.
No.
Okay,
Thanks.
okay. So that is the importance of trait-based approach, that if we can identify that there are certain traits which are actually associated with success of the invader, then at the time of introduction, for example, at least for intentional introduction for ornamental plants, if these species have those traits, then probably one needs to be more careful about it and try to contain it in the earlier stages. But to reach to that level where we can make certain those kinds of predictions, we need enough data to be able to make that prediction. And this trait based approach is still, I won't say completely new, but relatively new, and we need more data to build up to that prediction.
I I I don't see anything in the chat box. Oh, just a minute. But very informative lecture. Nicely elaborated, Megha. Nicely
Thank you.
elaborated.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Over to Manik.
Mhm.
Manik.
Thank you so
Manik.
much,
Yes.
Megha. Uh, we will stop if there is no questions. Yes, thanks a lot.
Yes. Yeah.
And
In chat box, it is very informative and interesting lecture.
Thank you, ma'am.
yeah, थँक्स अ लॉट.
Thank
आपण
thank you.
असेच भेटणार आहोत नेक्स्ट मंथ मध्ये वेगळ्या विषय घेऊन. तेव्हा जरूर जॉईन व्हा मंथली लेक्चरसाठी आणि बाकीच्या कार्यक्रमांसाठी. उद्यापासून आपला वर्ल्ड वॉटर वीक सप्ताह सुरू होत आहे. 8 दिवस आपल्या छान लेक्चर्स असणार आहेत. वर्तक सरांनी लिंक पाठवलेलीच आहे, तर सगळ्यांनी जॉईन व्हा. आणि आपण आता इथे थांबतोय. धन्यवाद.